we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.
As if a demolition team set off when you see the old demolitions of these old buildings.
It looks like one of those scenes of an old building being purposely dynamited and blown up.
A new world order where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
Watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under-infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
And the rule of law. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge. Now we can see a new world coming into view.
Some events echo through the pages of history, causing ripples decades or even centuries later. These secondary consequences are sometimes a direct result of the events themselves, but more often than not, they are driven by our perception, the mythology that we build around those events. The narrative of 9/11 defined the past decade. It was used to justify the Patriot Act, the indefinite detention provisions in the NDAA of 2012 and 2013, and it was used to take America into war against Afghanistan, then Iraq. 4,000 Americans may have died on that day, but well over 1 million civilians died based on the story of what happened. Of course, the fact that so much death and destruction was justified using that narrative makes it emotionally difficult for many Americans to re-examine it. After all, admitting you were wrong when nothing is at stake is hard enough. But if the official story of 9/11 is wrong, then this would mean that the US government killed all those civilians and shredded your Constitution based on a lie. And some of you were cheering them on. When people need to believe something, the facts matter very little. Reality can be twisted and bent into any shape needed, information discarded, and contradictions ignored. Never underestimate people's willingness to delude themselves. In America, where the need to believe is most entrenched, you'll rarely see September 11th addressed without some people resorting to third grader level name calling. Tinfoil hat, conspiracy theorists, conspiratards, 9/11 nutters. I'm sure you've heard these. It's the lowest and least sophisticated flavor of logical fallacy, the ad hominem. But it works when you're dealing with people who operate on a third grade level. What's most hilarious about this attempt to stigmatize those who dare question the official story is the fact that many of the members of the actual 9/11 Commission have spoken out to say that the investigation was a sham.
I want to start by asking you, as co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission, what your basic reaction is to this study by the Center for Public Integrity. It shows there were 935 statements, false statements, by these top 8 administration officials.
Well, I commend what the Center has done. It's taken exhaustive research to go through all of the statements made by these top public officials and to pick out the instances where they just flat out told us what was not the truth in order to move us towards war in Iraq. And I think you've performed a very valuable public service. And I hope the lesson that arises that comes from all of your work is that all of us have to be more skeptical of statements made by our public leaders and scrutinize those statements with very great care.
Look, why didn't they talk about Building 7 in the report?
That's good.
Why do you think that was
I don't
left out?
I don't have an easy answer for you. I would ask it.
Can you see this medical thing right now?
Yeah. Anyway,
Do
you support a criminal investigation into 9/11? Because I know yours was an exposition. It was not a criminal investigation.
I don't think so, but I don't know. I mean, I do support a permanent commission to examine not just that, but lots of other things in this area. So.
But if it's a permanent cover-up, then it's. I mean, if it's an act of war and it's hiding things, which everyone on your commission knew that the Pentagon was changing their stories, lying to you, and it's a cover-up of an act of war, and under Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, it's treason. So unless we get to the very bottom of it, then we're still talking a treasonous exposition.
This is a longer conversation. I'm not sure this one you ever get to the bottom of it.
We have to, or we can't save our country, sir.
I don't think. Well, if that's the condition upon which we're going to be saving our country, because the problem it's a 30-year-old conspiracy.
No, I'm talking about 9/11.
That's what I'm talking about.
Oh, you are. You mean at this?
Anyway.
Guys, it doesn't matter if the people who actually ran the investigation say it was a scam. You're supposed to believe the official story. If you don't, you're crazy, unhinged, and maybe even a little bit dangerous. Listen, I know you don't want anyone to think you're crazy, but let's just take a look at a little bit of the evidence, just between me and you. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Now, this isn't a 2-hour documentary, so we don't have time to cover everything. Instead, we'll just confront a few obvious smoking guns. Smoking gun number 1, the collapse of the World Trade Center Building 7. 3 buildings collapsed in New York on that day. 2 were hit by planes. Building 7 was not hit by a plane. No one claims that it was. Yet at 5:20 p.m. on September 11th, it collapsed into its own footprint. It went straight down at free fall speed. At first, NIST tried to deny this and placed its computer models over the actual video evidence. But in their final report, they do in fact admit that the building fell at free fall. Why is this significant?
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet.
This is high school physics. A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system without it being blown up.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
The funny thing is, in spite of the fact that never in history had a steel frame building collapsed due to an office fire, a lot of people knew the building was going to collapse before it came down. We have CNN reporting the collapse an hour before it came down.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
We also have the BBC who reported the collapse even though the building was still visible in the background.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York, behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. But this isn't the first building that has suffered as a result. We know that part of the Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed as a result of this huge amount of falling debris from 110 floors of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. As you can see behind me,
we have footage of people on the street warning that the building was about to collapse.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back.
How did they know that this was going to happen when it isn't even physically possible for an ordinary office fire to bend or melt steel? It makes about as much sense as a farmer suddenly warning you that his pig is about to levitate. And this brings us to smoking gun number 2. Explosions in the basements of the Twin Towers and on the lower floors of Building 7.
I worked in the building for 20 years. I was the person in charge of all the stairwells of the North Tower, and on 9/11 I had the only master key that opened the doors that rescue people. This is the master key, they call it the key of hope. And basically I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit, and then there was a series of explosions afterwards, and a person comes running into the office saying explosion, explosion, explosion. His skin was pulled all from his armpits all the way to the top of the fingertips, and pieces missing off his face, and then it was total chaos.
Stuart Kenny? Johanneman. Spell your name. JohannenEmann. And you were working there? Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
Mr. Hess came running back in and said, we're the only ones up here, we got to get out of here. He found the stairwell. So we subsequently went to the stairwell and we're going down the stairs. When we reached the 6th floor, the landing that we were standing on gave way. There was an explosion and the landing gave way. And I was left there hanging. I had to climb back up and now I had to walk back up to the 8th floor. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down. All this time, I'm hearing all types of explosions. All this time, I'm hearing explosions. When they finally got to us, and they took us down to what they called the lobby, because I asked them, I said, when we got down there, I said, where are we? He said, this was the lobby. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. It was total ruins. Total ruins. Now keep in mind, when I came in there, the lobby had nice escalators. It was a huge lobby. And for me to see what I saw, it was unbelievable. I'm just confused about one thing, and one thing only. Why World Trade Center 7 went down in the first place. I'm very confused about that. I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The explanation I got was it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was a fuel oil tank, it would have been one side of the building.
This, of course, brings us to smoking gun number 3, molten steel found in the basements of the buildings after the collapse.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
It wasn't just Building 7 that went down like a controlled demolition. All 3 buildings that collapsed in New York that day came down at freefall speed. The thousands of tons of steel and concrete beams that should have resisted such a collapse were blown apart as the building was falling. Over 1,700 licensed architects and engineers have gone on record to say that the official 9/11 story is physically impossible. It would have required carefully placed explosives to take out the support beams. And guess what? The dust from the ruins of the towers has been independently tested and shown to contain large quantities of military-grade nanothermite. The results of these tests were peer-reviewed and published in the Open Chemical Physics Journal in 2009. However, the agency behind the official investigation, NIST, has refused from the very beginning to test for any accelerants or explosives in the dust. This in spite of the fact that such testing is explicitly called for in fire investigation standards for events involving this kind of damage.
My name is Mark Basile. I'm a chemical engineer. I have a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I've worked for about 25 years in industry, and the majority of what I do is analytical work and figuring out what materials are composed of, why they are, why they do what they do. It's basically a lot of material science is what I do. In December of 2007, I attended a conference in Boston on 9/11 where Stephen Jones was going to be speaking about his work on the iron-based microspheres. I attended the conference and listened to him talk, where he also, for the first time, discussed his discovery of the red-gray chips that we'll get into a little bit later here. After he spoke, I approached him and I was interested in being put in contact with a source for World Trade Center dust to independently look at the material and either confirm or deconfirm what he had found. About a month later, I received my first sample of World Trade Center dust from Jeanette McKinley, which was one of the individuals that was spoken of in his report on the thermetic materials that he put out in March of 2009, I think it was. So anyway, I received a sample of dust in January of 2008 and basically started working with the material. I found iron-based microspheres in there, just as he had done, and I also found the red-gray chips that he had spoken of. I created an apparatus where I could basically control energy input to the chips, heating them resistively on a stainless steel heater strip to an ignition temperature, not overheating them, but just bringing them up to the ignition temperature, and then analyzing the resultant products. And what I can confirm also is that these chips The red layer is thermitic. It does produce molten iron, and I've seen it in a number of chips that Jeanette McKinley supplied to me, and I've also seen it in an independent sample that was also supplied to me from a museum in New York, which is asked to remain anonymous at this point. One of the things I'd like to stress about these chips is that they really shouldn't be there. They're not a natural formed agglomeration of aluminum from the aircraft or materials that were in the building and iron oxide that got knocked off. It isn't just a haphazard bringing together of iron oxide and aluminum, which is the basic components of thermite. This is a material that is made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical. It's in a silica-based matrix that holds the whole thing together, and when they're ignited, these iron droplets that are formed basically eat through the silica matrix and form both droplets, and that actually creates these large relative voids within the residue of the chip that are all coated with iron films inside.
We're not even scratching the surface here. No matter what part of the official story you look at, there are glaring holes that require magical thinking to explain away. You were lied to, pure and simple, and a lot of people were killed based on that lie. I know that's uncomfortable to look at, but it's the truth.
The French filmmakers, the Naudet brothers, were in New York City doing a documentary about the New York City firefighters. And this clip is the only known footage of the first plane hitting the first tower. Now, this video clip that we've just examined came again from the Naudet brothers documentary that was being filmed in the streets of New York City on the morning of September 11th. This documentary about the New York City firefighters was going to be assembled at a later date, and it was not televised. In fact, there was no live coverage at all of Flight 11 as it hit the North Tower. After all, it was a surprise attack. So if there was no live television coverage of the first plane hitting the first tower, how do we explain the following comment from George Walker Bush?
What was the first thing that went through your head when you heard that a plane crashed into the first?
Well, I was sitting in a schoolhouse in Florida. I'd gone down to tell my little brother what to do, and you can go ahead and sit down. Just kidding, Jeb. And it's the mother in me. Anyway, I was sitting there, and my chief of staff, well, first of all, when we walked in the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and you know, I thought it was pilot error. I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and you know, I thought it was pilot error.
I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on.
I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on.
I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on.
I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on.
I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on.
There was no live coverage at all of Flight 11 as it hit the North Tower.
I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on.
There was no live coverage at all of Flight 11 as it hit the North Tower.
Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, you know, it's time for politics. And it's an absurd insinuation. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Away from the guilty. Away from the guilty.
Away from the guilty.
Guilty. Guilty. Guilty.
Guilty.
You're enjoying life. You're enjoying liberty. You're pursuing happiness. You're doing all right. When the other guy's around and he means business, so get going. Remember, you're off base. You've just got time to save yourself. Drop whatever you're doing. Find the nearest hole and make like a mole. Pick a room in a good building close to the ground. It ought to be airtight and light-proof as possible, with the doors shut, windows closed.
It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Duck and cover. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do.
If you saw it advancing on you a mile away, you'd have about 30 seconds to take cover. Make for the nearest entrance, but be orderly about it.
If you are at home when a surprise attack occurs, crawl beneath a table if it is very near, or drop to the floor with your back to the window.
That fog has contaminated everything it touched with radioactive matter, which we'll call hot stuff, although it hasn't anything to do with its temperature.
After many generations lived under the fear of a nuclear war, it took only a few images from New York on September 11 to awaken in the American population some familiar ghosts, and to bring psychologically to its knees a nation that had never experienced an attack on its territory before. Confused between the fear of an unknown enemy and an ill-repressed thirst for revenge, Americans flatly accepted a war, the invasion of Afghanistan, that had already been planned to the smallest detail.
Our grief has turned to anger, and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
Who really wanted the New York and Washington attacks? Who was truly responsible? The United States immediately accused Osama bin Laden, although they never produced the evidence they claimed to have against him. Nor did anyone express any particular surprise about the lack of a true motive on the part of bin Laden himself. It was as if the entire world was ready to accept that he was the evildoer just by someone pointing the finger at him. Everyone seems satisfied with the idea that bin Laden allegedly hated our civilization. This, however, is clearly at odds with the fact that he has never actually claimed responsibility for the attacks. The first thing every terrorist in the world has ever been concerned with was to put forward some kind of statement clearly explaining the reasons behind their act. Bin Laden instead, a few days after the attacks, clearly stated that he had nothing to do with them at all. Only 3 months later would the CIA find a home video in Afghanistan in which bin Laden implies to have had pre-knowledge of the events while talking to a Saudi friend. The images, however, are so poor the video ended up posing more questions than it ever answered. To a closer examination, the man's features only resemble those of bin Laden, but the identity of the person can be anything but certain. In any case, a talk with a friend on a questionable videotape is not an official claim. The world is filled with psychopaths who accuse themselves of crimes they never committed, but without a good motive, they seldom even manage to get arrested. In 2006, the FBI stated that they never had any hard evidence against bin Laden, which contradicted the initial claims by the administration. The Bureau's website lists bin Laden as wanted for the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, but he is only suspected of other terrorist activities in the world. Officially, Osama bin Laden has never been wanted for the September 11 attacks.
A new age of wickedness.
Popular journalist and radio host Alex Jones, who has been pointing the finger at the U.S. administration since the beginning, had foreseen the attacks 1 month before they took place, and exactly by the hand of bin Laden. This recording is from July 25, 2001.
And I want you to let them know that if there is any terrorism, we know who to blame. If any terrorism comes, it's from this government. And if there was an outside threat like a bin Laden, who was a known CIA asset in the 80s, he's the boogeyman they need.
19 hijackers of the planes had crashed into the World Trade Center towers, into the Pentagon, and into the rural area in Pennsylvania.
Seen from up close, the official version soon started to show some serious weaknesses. Too many curious events, too many inconsistencies, too many coincidences pointed at the possibility that the truth had been somewhat different from what we had been told. This set off an unprecedented investigation on the internet. Thousands of independent researchers from all over the world ended up bringing to light so many faults in the official version that it legitimized suspicion that the U.S. administration had some kind of role in the attacks. From flight amateurs who perform highly acrobatic maneuvers without ever having piloted a jet in their life, to passports, personal wills, and terrorists' bandanas conveniently emerging from a hole where the plane cannot be found. From an entire Boeing 757 disappearing in a 15-foot wide hole, to modern steel buildings collapsing against the most fundamental laws of physics, it has become very difficult today to maintain that the official version reflects what truly happened on that day. In fact, in 2006, almost half of Americans believe that the Bush administration covered up the truth about 9/11. And the protests of those requesting a new, truly independent investigation keep increasing by the day. The more evidence that is gathered towards an inside job, however, the more it seems that it was not the work of the American government, but of a small group of people, the so-called neocons, or neoconservatives, who came to power with the election of George W. Bush in the year 2000.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully...
These are some of the founders of the so-called PNAC, or Project for the New American Century. Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, whose political alliance dates back some 30 years ago.
In my opinion, treason. The cabal of neoconservatives at PNAC, I think you all know what that is, who planned this war, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Libby, Pearl, this cabal knew the American people would not stand for a war against Iraq unless there was, as they put it in their own document, a new Pearl Harbor. 9/11 supplied that.
According to this theory, President Bush was not part of the original project, which coincidentally happened when he was out of town.
We talk about tax cuts.
You can talk about it at the next event.
Different elements seem to support this theory.
Emma Booker, elementary school.
First of all, the fact that the Secret Service, who are in charge of the president's safety, allowed Bush to remain in the school for over half an hour after the second tower in New York had been hit.
The second plane is in the second tower.
At that point, the president had clearly become a possible target, and the duty of the Secret Service was to remove him immediately from a place where everybody knew he was at the time.
He was made aware that the first jetliner was struck.
However, no one seems to have worried about his safety, nor about the children at the school, or the school's personnel around him. It was as if someone within the Secret Service knew that the school was not going to be a target.
May God bless the victims, their families.
Furthermore, when Bush tried to get back to Washington, the White House gave warning that Air Force One was the next target, forcing the pilot of the presidential plane to a hurried, spectacular takeoff.
This is Air Force One departing Sarasota, Florida. Yes, it's 9:07.
The journalists traveling with the president later commented, "It was like a rocket. For a good 10 minutes, it kept climbing almost vertically."
This is Ann Compton with a pool report. I am with the president.
As Bush was frantically trying to communicate with Dick Cheney, the lines with the White House kept cutting off. Frustrated, the president pounded on his desk, shouting, "This is inexcusable. Get me the vice president." After a stop in Louisiana, Air Force One landed in a military base in Nebraska. From here, the president and his staff were transferred to an underground bunker, where they remained locked up for the rest of the afternoon. After these multiple detours, President Bush was able to return to Washington only in the evening, when all the major decisions had already been made. It was later found that the threats to Air Force One never existed. Thus begins to form a picture of a president unaware of the facts, and somehow held hostage by the neocons who were effectively in charge throughout the whole day. At the White House was Vice President Cheney. At the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and next to him his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz.
It is a shell game.
This is what Michael Ledeen, one of the most influential neoconservatives, had to say about the presidency of George W. Bush.
All right, so he became president, but he didn't know why. And on September 11th, he discovered why.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. I have a message for our military. Be ready.
But who are the neocons? The neoconservative school of thought can be traced to the University of Chicago's Professor Leo Strauss, who began enunciating its principles by the end of the 60s.
It's sort of a happy happening for hippies.
It was the time of the flower children, of the civil rights battles, of sexual liberation and individual freedom, which had reached levels never imagined before. All of this, however, for Strauss, represented only the seed of a rapid and disastrous decadence for the entire American nation. According to his thinking, individual freedom leads to personal conflicts, which undermine the nation's potential for growth and success. What Strauss envisioned was a compact, uniform society held together by a universal glue that would allow each individual to pour their personal ambitions into a collective movement, all directed toward the outside. But the only way to obtain this was to face the population with a large, dark enemy, whose existence would threaten the survival of the American nation. Among Strauss's most enthusiastic followers was a young Paul Wolfowitz. The idea of creating an evil enemy to bring together a whole nation was certainly not new. From Nero to Hitler, history is filled with examples in which this strategy was used with great success. The novelty introduced by the neocons, however, was that for the first time in history, the adversary would be the entire world. The main obstacle for the neocons was represented by Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, who pursued with foreign countries a policy of détente based on solid bilateral agreements. But when Nixon was forced to resign due to the Watergate scandal, the neocons were able to place next to the new president, Gerald Ford, a Secretary of Defense who would find himself in the same position some 30 years later, Donald Rumsfeld. Another neocon who was able to take advantage of the situation was Dick Cheney, who became Chief of Staff for the new president. Thus, the White House started to become a familiar territory for these men, who envisioned a strong America that imposed its rule to the rest of the world and led the other nations in the eternal fight of good versus evil. In spite of some relatively quiet times with Russia, it was in fact Donald Rumsfeld who kept trying to enlarge the appearance of an enemy that history itself would later reveal as totally non-existent.
The Soviet Union has been busy. They've been busy in terms of their level of effort. They've been busy in terms of the actual weapons that they've been producing. They've been busy in terms of expanding production rates. They've been busy in terms of expanding their institutional capability to produce additional weapons at additional rates. They've been busy in terms of expanding their capability to increasingly improve the sophistication of those weapons. Year after year after year, they've been demonstrating that they have steadiness of purpose, that they're purposeful about what they're doing.
Since none of this, however, was reflected by the current intelligence, Rumsfeld managed to convince President Ford to create an independent group to re-examine all the information that the CIA had gathered about the Russians from the beginning. The group was called Team B, and it was put under the direction of the neoconservative Richard Pipes, who took under his wing a young and enthusiastic Paul Wolfowitz. Team B's true purpose was to manipulate the CIA's original intelligence with the intent of presenting the Soviet Union as a truly evil nation, equipped with the most powerful secret technology, whose only intent was to annihilate the United States. Naturally, by the end of their task, Pipes and Wolfowitz presented a report containing a truly terrifying image of the Soviet Empire. It was, however, a false image, born of the projection of their own need for a powerful enemy towards which to direct the precious energies of the nation that were being absorbed by a moral relativism that they deemed unacceptable. The new Carter presidency imposed a temporary setback in their path to world domination. The need to quickly reconquer the White House led the neocons to seek an alliance in a totally uncharted territory, the religious one, which accounted for a large amount of potential new votes. Traditionally, the leaders of the different Protestant denominations had kept their flocks away from politics, a world they considered immoral and corrupt. But the fear of falling under communist rule, which would have also brought atheism along, was apparently sufficient to provide the basis for a historic alliance that has lasted ever since.
I'm sick and tired of hearing about all of the radicals and the perverts and the liberals and the leftists and the communists coming out of the closets It's time for God's people to come out of the closets, out of the churches, and change America. We must do it.
Ronald Reagan won the 1980 election by a landslide. And at that point, the neocons felt they had the right to claim some important positions in the new administration. Paul Wolfowitz became the head of external relations for the White House, while a friend of his from the times of Strauss, Richard Pearl, was appointed Deputy Secretary of Defense. But the great enemy they were seeking was in the meantime collapsing under the weight of internal divisions and corruption. The last attempt by the Soviets to expand their influence was the invasion of Afghanistan in 1980. It was then that the CIA engaged Osama bin Laden and his freedom fighters, providing them with all the logistical, military, and strategic support to push the Soviets back to their borders. With the departure of the Russians from Kabul, the process of disintegration that would lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall had well begun. Before the collapse of the traditional enemy made of chicken wire, the neocons began to entertain the notion of extending their military and strategic control to the entire world.
We want to change some deeply entrenched notions about the proper role of American power in the world.
But controlling the world over the last century has always meant to control the supply of energy, which means to control the oil and gas resources in the Middle East. This is not a new concept at all.
The British checkmated Hitler in Syria when they moved in before the Nazis could take over, thus cutting off a potential source of oil for the German panzer divisions. Iran, too, is the same story. The British, with this coup, control almost all of the Middle East oil supply. This is the oil that Hitler badly needed but lost. And with Russia in the way, he can't win the Caucasian oil fields.
The golden opportunity came with the first Gulf War in 1991. At the crucial moment, however, with the Iraqi troops in total disarray, President Bush decided to stop the push and leave Saddam Hussein at the head of the nation. The ambitions of global control of the neocons suffered another temporary setback, which turned into a never-ending nightmare with the unexpected victory of Bill Clinton in the 1992 elections. Meanwhile, Russia was pulling itself up again, and the neocons could see the opportunity of world domination slip away year after year.
Ever since the Cold War ended, there were people who were fuming on the right, thinking, this is the golden opportunity now that Russia's out of the way for America to take over the world. We're not doing anything about it. Those damn liberals, those soft heads, are keeping us from doing what is our godly mission.
As they sat waiting for the end of Clinton's mandate, the neocons put together the so-called Wolfowitz Doctrine, which established the right of the United States to engage in preemptive war anywhere in the world, in order to avoid other nations from challenging their supremacy. Thus was born a precise strategic plan of global reach, which we have come to know as the PNAC, or Project for the New American Century. After the return to the White House, with the controversial election won by George Bush in the year 2000, the neocons needed to rehash the operation left uncompleted by the father 10 years before. We now find Dick Cheney as Vice President, Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense, and as his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz. In order to restart the gigantic war machine, however, it would not be sufficient to awaken the Soviet ghosts, which in the meantime had been relegated to the pages of history. A different kind of enemy was needed. It had to be everywhere and nowhere, elusive but ever present, in order to inject in the American population enough fear for them to support a military response of global reach. With a few touch-ups, Al-Qaeda, which was the name of the database with all the names of the people the CIA had sent to fight with bin Laden, became the name of the most powerful terrorist organization in the world. Bin Laden saw himself accused of the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania and of the American ship Cole, without having claimed responsibility for them. The suspicion that someone within the CIA and FBI was building an artificial figure to be used in false flag terrorist operations seems to be confirmed by internal conflicts that have reached as high as the presidency itself.
After the Cole, I had battle plans drawn to go into Afghanistan, overthrow the Taliban, and launch a full-scale attack search for bin Laden. But we needed basing rights in Uzbekistan, which we got after 9/11. The CIA and the FBI refused to certify that bin Laden was responsible while I was there. No one knew Al-Qaeda existed then.
The Western media, however, had already made up their minds. Bin Laden was the bad guy, and from him anything could be expected at that point. On the eve of September 10th, 2001, a full plan to attack Afghanistan with strong support to the Northern Alliance was placed on Bush's table, to be signed by the president upon his return from Florida. All that was needed was a detonator to set in motion the operation that would have finally brought America to the strategic control of worldwide resources and the neocons to the realization of their dream. Let's take a step back and read some paragraphs from the final PNAC document, which was published in September of the year 2000. In the chapter called Creating Tomorrow's Dominant Force, we can read, "At present, the United States faces no global rival. America's grand strategy should aim to preserve and extend this advantageous position as far into the future as possible. The United States must retain sufficient forces able to rapidly deploy and win multiple simultaneous large-scale wars. The United States must reposition U.S. forces to respond to 21st century strategic realities by shifting permanently based forces to Southeast Europe and Southeast Asia. The Army's annual budget must increase to the $90 to $95 billion level. Specialized Air Force aircraft, like the J-Stars above, are too few in numbers to meet current mission demand. The Army should accelerate its plans to purchase medium-weight vehicles. The transformation effort must be considered as pressing a military mission as preparing for today's theater wars. Further, the process of transformation, even if it brings a revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
Jap planes without warning bring war to America. Our great Pacific outpost in the Hawaiian Islands is ruthlessly bombed as Japan's perfidious declaration of war. Death and destruction unleashed on a nation at peace. On that fateful Sunday morning when this country was extending a friendly hand of conciliation and peace. The treacherous attacks brought death to almost 3,000 American soldiers, sailors, and civilians. Our loss in warships and planes was high, but overnight this nation was united in an all-out determination to avenge the hideous assault on American lives and property. Our battle cry is, remember Pearl Harbor.
Dense black smoke billowed to the sky as the massive control tower began to keel over. The Arizona's courageous crew stuck to its guns until the very end. Here was displayed heroism that will live forever in the glorious annals and traditions of the American Navy.
September 11 was not the first time America was drawn into a war by an ambiguous incident. The American Constitution doesn't allow the United States to wage a preemptive war, and reserves for Congress the power of declaring war to another nation. For this reason, every time a president has wanted to enter a war or to begin a new one, he has had to wait for a military incident, whether created or provoked, to justify the use of force in front of Congress and the American people. In 1898, the United States went to war against Spain in order to take control of the Caribbean area. The pretext came from the sinking of the USS Maine, which was anchored near the Cuban island. The Spanish were immediately accused of the attack, even though they sternly denied any involvement in it. The images of the sunken vessel and those of the sailors' funerals were shown in the first movie theaters of the nation, thus generating a strong wave of indignation that allowed Theodore Roosevelt, then Secretary of the Navy, to start a war he had already prepared to the smallest detail. Only in 1980, almost a century later, would America recognize that the Spanish were not responsible for the attack. In order not to accuse themselves, however, the United States declared that the Maine was sunk because some explosives had been stacked too close to the steam room. In the meantime, the entire Spanish Armada had been wiped out, and America had become the new maritime power, with strategic positions going from the Caribbean to the Philippine Islands. In 1915, it was the sinking of the USS Lusitania by a German submarine to trigger the crisis that would eventually bring the United States into the First World War. It appears, however, that the U.S. had secretly slipped to the Germans the information that the ship was carrying a special cargo of weapons headed to England. This provoked the reaction from the German submarine, which sunk the vessel on which more than 100 Americans were also traveling. In 1941, it was the infamous Pearl Harbor attack to generate a wave of indignation large enough for President Roosevelt to declare war on Japan.
The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Almost 3,000 sailors died in the surprise attack. History would later reveal that the administration knew of the attack in advance, but it did everything possible to delay the transfer of information to the Hawaiian port. This was confirmed by Admiral Kimmel, the port's commander who helplessly witnessed the massacre of his crews and the destruction of his vessels.
We needed one thing, which our own resources could not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. I did not get this information.
In 1964, the United States decided to officially declare war on North Vietnam. The war pretext came from the so-called Tonkin Gulf incident, in which North Vietnamese boats were accused of having launched torpedoes against the American destroyer Maddox. Then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara immediately announced to the press the upcoming military action.
Immediately following the attack, U.S. representatives in Saigon met with representatives of the South Vietnamese government. They jointly agreed that joint retaliatory action was required. The President's approval of this action.
But McNamara, 40 years later, would openly confess that the attack on the Maddox never took place.
No, it was just confusion. And events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong. It didn't happen.
In the meantime, more than 60,000 U.S. soldiers and over 3 million Vietnamese civilians lost their lives. In 1990, the situation between the United States and Iraq had grown tense, and the group of neoconservatives around President Bush convinced him it was time to attack Saddam Hussein. The U.S. secretly informed Saddam that they had nothing against him taking over the oil fields of Kuwait, a territory the Iraqi dictator had always claimed as his own. Saddam took the bait, and Iraq invaded Kuwait.
Tonight, the first pictures of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
At that point, Dick Cheney, who was then Secretary of Defense, gave Saudi Arabia some satellite photos in which 250,000 Iraqi soldiers could be seen amassing behind the Kuwaiti border. Fearing an invasion, the Saudis granted the U.S. the extraordinary permission to establish military bases on the territory. At the same time, the worldwide media launched a heavy campaign against Saddam, who was accused of having used lethal gas against his own people. No mention was made to the fact that the gas had been sold to Saddam by the United States, which then stood silent during the massacre, even though they were perfectly aware of it. The media campaign against the Iraqi dictator reached its peak with this touching testimony from a young Kuwaiti nurse, who described to the world the atrocities committed by the Iraqi soldiers in her invaded country.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The news shocked the entire world, and from that moment no one had a word to say about the American bombing of Iraq. Ten years later, some journalists stumbled onto a set of satellite photographs taken by the Russians over the same desert in the same days.
It's what it didn't show that was more important. What you would have expected to have seen were tanks on the border. There were none that could be seen. There was nothing behind the border that could have supported that kind of number of troops and tanks.
The same pictures that showed the Iraqi tanks in Kuwait City also showed that there was absolutely nothing behind the Saudi border. Not a tank, not a vehicle, not a single man. At the same time, the nurse who had brought to tears the entire world turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington. She had faked the entire incubator story after having been professionally trained by one of the most important advertising agencies in Washington, Hill and Knowlton. In the meantime, the U.S. had wiped out the entire Iraqi army and had managed to establish permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia. In a cruel and ruthless shooting spree, and against all international treaties, the U.S. Air Forces literally destroyed and turned to ashes thousands of Iraqi soldiers on their way back to Baghdad. Before taking this picture, the photographer wrote on the side of the tank, "If I don't photograph this, people like my mom will think that war is what they see on TV." Besides the historic cases, there are also many plans of deception that, for one reason or another, were never used in the real world. One of them is called Operation Northwoods, a 1962 CIA secret plan that was declassified a few years ago. At that time, the United States was trying to regain control of Cuba, which had been lost to Fidel Castro's revolution 3 years before. Under the subject Justifications for a Military Intervention in Cuba, we can read the following proposals. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. We could blow up a drone, unmanned vessel anywhere in the Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such incident in the vicinity of Havana or Santiago as a spectacular result of a Cuban attack from the air or sea or both. The U.S. could follow up with an air-sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Casualties lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even Washington. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees even to the extent of wounding, in instances to be widely publicized. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft should appear to continue as harassing measures condoned by the government of Cuba. And then there was this interesting idea. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. At a designated time, that duplicate will be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. Takeoff times of the drone aircraft and the actual aircraft would be scheduled to allow a rendezvous south of Florida. From the rendezvous point, the passenger-carrying aircraft will descend to minimum altitude and go directly into an auxiliary field at Eglin Air Force Base, where arrangements will have been made to evacuate the passengers and return the aircraft to its original status. What happens to those passengers is not clear. The drone aircraft, meanwhile, will continue to fly the filed flight plan. When over Cuba, the drone would be transmitting on the international distress frequency a Mayday message stating it is under attack by Cuban MiG aircraft. The transmission will be interrupted by the destruction of the aircraft, which would be triggered by a radio signal. Since also Flight American 77 disappeared from the radar screens before reappearing in the Pentagon area, could something similar have happened with the plane that hit the Pentagon as well? The American military elite seems to respond to the recurring need of waging wars of conquest, both to increase the control on worldwide resources and to maintain a healthy and productive war industry that is among the most profitable altogether. It only makes sense that also the tanks, the submarines, and the military planes that are produced every day must be put to use within a certain amount of time, just like any other industrial product we consume. This is a military planes graveyard located near Tucson, Arizona. Most of these machines are still in good shape, but they are put away and slowly dismantled as they become obsolete. President Eisenhower, himself a former general, was among the first ones to foresee the danger that a permanent military industry could represent for his country.
I get tired of saying that defense is to be made an excuse for wasting dollars. I don't believe we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to.
Before he left office in 1961, he gave a memorable speech that today appears as a lucid prophecy.
This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Eisenhower's prophecy, unfortunately, became true.
The rush of battle. The glory of victory. the birth of heroes. These are the movies that brought the front lines to the front row. Every Saturday night, the Military Channel brings you the films that went beyond the battlefield and showed you war like...
Fed by a culture of war, which has even created its own television channel called the Military Channel.
On the Military Channel.
The arms industry is enjoying one of the most productive and rewarding times thanks to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In the meantime, the Pentagon's budget has risen to over $400 billion per year. That's more than 4 times the amount that the neoconservatives ever dared to dream in the year 2000. To maintain the Bush administration war doctrine, massive increases in military spending have been required. The United States now spends more than $400 billion annually on the military, 7 times as much as the next biggest spender, and nearly equal to what the rest of the world spends combined. Obviously, the large corporations like Boeing, Lockheed, or Raytheon produce weapons not only for the United States, but also for the rest of the world.
It is an incredible thing that we arm the world and then turn around and come to Congress and say, look at all these weapons out there. They're almost superior to ours. They're comparable to ours. Well, of course they are. They're ours. We sold them to them.
It takes mobility to win the day. Our forces need to be fast and agile.
The Hellfire 2 missile system defeats advanced armor by semi-active laser guidance. And
such a system is Skyguard, a high-energy laser shield against short-range rockets.
Hellfire 2 is the weapon of choice on Apache, Super Cobra, SH-60, and HH-60 helicopters.
Part of a system delivering unprecedented levels of assured networked interconnectivity.
Airborne Laser is making impressive progress on its way to demonstrating the lethality of a megawatt-class directed energy weapon system. Skyguard is designed to stop the conventional man-pad.
Advanced EHF's phased arrays also deliver a new super agile, providing a 12-fold increase in cross-link data.
In the case of a ground-to-air attack, sensors detect the missile's launch and the fire unit slews to acquire. This technology has addressed the deadly Katyusha rocket, a weapon favored by terrorists. This is the muzzle of this powerful laser system to protect mobile forces as well as high-value assets. Multiple kills are readily handled, all at the speed of light, and providing force protection when and where it is needed.
In September 1991, shortly after the end of the Cold War, a cabal of elite bankers and intelligence spooks led by George H.W. Bush financed a $240 billion covert operations war chest through the purchase of 10-year securities that, as it happened, were scheduled to come due on September 12, 2001. Project Hammer was undoubtedly used for a wide variety of illicit intelligence operations, but mainly it was used to finance a covert economic operation against the collapsing Soviet Union, whereby unknown Western investors bought up much of the Soviet industry with a focus on oil and gas, crashing the Russian economy, looting its central bank, orchestrating what became known as the Great Ruble Scam, and a wide variety of other clandestine, state-assisted operations designed to thoroughly prevent Russia from ever contesting the U.S. as a world superpower, while in the process lining the pockets of these economic hitmen who swooped in to devour the collapsing Russian economy after the fall of the Soviet Union. A spectacular investment for all, at least until money laundering investigations began tracing all the money, or when the 10-year deadline came up and the securities became due and began the routine process of authenticity and ownership checks. Evidence shows that several federal and private investigations had already stumbled upon the Hammer Fund and were compiling evidence on it up until the 9/11 attacks. These included the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, which was moved to the outer E-ring of the recently renovated section of the Pentagon that was targeted and destroyed on 9/11. According to E.P. Heidner, the ONI had been investigating crimes associated with the plundering of Russia. 39 out of the 40 people who worked in those offices were killed on 9/11, including the entire chain of command. The Pentagon's financial accounting offices in that same wing were also an obvious target, as were the passengers on board Flight 77, many of whom coincidentally held top-secret clearances and were connected with Pentagon black operations. Agents of the Office of Naval Intelligence had also been investigating financial transactions which were linked to securities being managed by those securities dealers in the World Trade Center that were also targeted. 31% of the 125 fatalities in the Pentagon were from the Naval Command Center that housed the Office of Naval Intelligence. 41% of the fatalities in the Twin Towers came from two companies that managed U.S. government securities, Cantor Fitzgerald and Eurobrokers. There were three major security brokers in the World Trade Center: Cantor Fitzgerald, Eurobrokers, and Garbin Intercapital. At 8:46 on the morning of September 11th, Flight 11 flew directly into Marshall McLennan's secure computer room in the North Tower, right below the floor on which Cantor Fitzgerald was situated. Cantor Fitzgerald was the largest security dealer in the U.S. Shortly after that, a massive explosion went off just under the FBI offices in the North Tower on the 23rd floor. Fires were reported on the 22nd floor at 8:47. There were also explosions and subsequent fires reported at Garbin Intercapital on the 25th floor and in the basement of Tower 1 as well. Shortly thereafter, at 9:03, Flight 175 hit the South Tower right below the floors on which Eurobrokers was situated. In all three cases, the explosive, fiery destruction consumed the offices and the several floors above, destroying files and trapping victims inside. In the midst of all this, Building 6 was destroyed by an explosion that took place before either tower fell. This secondary explosion took out a portion of the building which just happened to include the El Dorado Task Force's offices. The El Dorado Task Force was an interagency money laundering watchdog group responsible for coordinating all major money laundering investigations in the U.S. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, these groups would be redirected to investigate terrorist financing. Building 6 was located directly between the North Tower and World Trade Center Building 7. While large portions of World Trade Center 6 were gutted by explosions and later by falling debris from the North Tower, the building itself did not suffer a global symmetric collapse at near freefall acceleration as did Buildings 1, 2, and 7. FEMA photographer and 9/11 whistleblower Kurt Sonnenfeld took some interesting pictures of the U.S. Customs Vault in the basement of World Trade Center 6, which was found completely empty and left with the door wide open. All of its contents appear to have been looted during the attacks. There is also evidence that gold was being looted from the vaults beneath World Trade Center 4. There were several early reports of a 10-wheel truck packed with stolen bullion caught fleeing World Trade Center 5 when the vehicle had become stuck on a collapsed ceiling brace, forcing the driver to flee the scene. Many researchers have stumbled across one or two of these anomalies from time to time: the empty vaults, the secondary explosions, the fireproofing upgrades on the exact floors coinciding with failure and impact in the towers, the suspicious power downs and evacuation drills, the World Trade Center tenants and security firms like AIG, Marsh & McLennan, and Kroll, and their close ties with the intelligence community, etc., etc. These anomalies are not unrelated, but nevertheless became lost inside the chaos of that September morn, the aftermath, and subsequent cover-ups. Okay, so what does all this mean? Overall, a critical mass of brokers from the major government security brokerages in the Twin Towers had to be eliminated to create chaos in the government securities market. A situation needed to be created wherein $240 billion of covert securities could be electronically cleared without anyone asking questions, which happened when the Federal Reserve declared an emergency and invoked its emergency powers that very afternoon. On September 14th, the Securities and Exchange Commission declared a national emergency and for the first time in U.S. history invoked its emergency powers under the Securities Exchange Act Section 12K and eased regulatory restrictions for clearing and settling security trades for the next 15 days. These changes would have allowed the estimated $240 billion in covert government securities to be cleared upon maturity without the standard regulatory controls around identification of ownership. The towers needed to be demolished to create a big enough mess that the illicit activities taking place behind the scenes that morning could be hidden in the confusion of that day. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about who did it and how. 9/11 whistleblower Richard Andrew Grove was a software salesperson for a company called Silverstream. Silverstream's technology was on the cutting edge of Internet solutions, offering software to web-enable the critical business functions of Fortune 500 companies, basically integrating and making available on the web the disparate legacy applications and mainframes while simultaneously streamlining workflow and traditional paper processes, with an end result being a lower cost of operation and more efficient transactions. Silverstream had built internet transactional and trading platforms for Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, Bankers Trust, Alex Brown, and Morgan Stanley, to name a few. Leading up to 9/11, Silverstream was designing specialized accounting software for a major client, Marsh & McLennan. Marsh is the world's largest insurance brokerage and was located right below Cantor Fitzgerald in the North Tower. Approximately 295 Marsh employees were murdered that morning, along with other innocent victims and employees who either knew too much or too little about their chosen work environment. But most importantly, Silverstream provided a specific type of connectivity that was used to link AIG and Marsh & McLennan, the first two commercial companies on the planet to employ this type of transaction. What then were Marsh and AIG doing, and why did they need to leverage technologies that no other commercial entity on the face of the earth needed to use to conduct business? The recovered hard drives from the World Trade Center, combined with Richard Grove's testimony, give us some intriguing clues. Grove discovered that Silverstream was overbilling Marsh to the tune of $7 million extra for fictitious and unneeded hardware. He also became aware of an exploitable flaw in the accounting software that had been sold to a variety of Marsh's clients and partners. When he brought this up to his superiors at Silverstream and others at Marsh, he was told to keep quiet and not to worry about it. But other friends of his at Marsh were also getting concerned and began documenting what was going on and raising concerns within the company. At last, they were finally granted a hearing with one of Marsh's high-ranking executives and were told to bring all their evidence to a hearing scheduled for 8:30 a.m. on September 11, 2001, on the 93rd floor. The high-ranking member of Marsh, who Grove did not name, would participate via teleconference from the safety of his home, while Marsh employees and potential whistleblowers, Gary Lasko, Catherine Lee, Ken Rice, Richard Breuhardt, and John Olzhofer, would die in the meeting room in the North Tower with all their evidence when American Airlines Flight 11 would impact that very section of the building. Richard Grove fortunately got stuck in traffic that morning and didn't make it. Computer hard drives recovered from the World Trade Center show a spike in suspicious transfers that took place within the World Trade Center as the 9/11 attacks were unfolding. Richard Grove is convinced that these suspicious money transfers were performed electronically using Silverstream software, and that the overbilling of Marsh was hush money for the operations. It would certainly have helped clear up that $240 billion in securities and make it look like any of those companies might have done it. The recovered hard drives and financial transactions from 9/11 all show clear evidence that something was going on that morning. Marsh's CEO at the time was Jeffrey Greenberg, the son of Maurice Greenberg of AIG. Most insurance companies were hurting badly in late 2001 after $40 billion in insurance settlements had been paid out for the devastation caused by the 9/11 attacks. Yet one insurance company did not suffer quite the same losses as the other companies did. American International Group, or AIG as it turns out, is much more than an insurance company. With its long ties to the intelligence community, AIG was founded by OSS operative Cornelius V. Starr, 2 R's, the uncle of Clinton's friend Kenneth Starr. AIG currently operates a complex network of shell companies and other entities which operate internationally and have been used for clandestine intelligence gathering and other covert activities for decades. The company that ran security in the World Trade Center, Kroll Associates, was owned by AIG. The CEO of AIG on 9/11 was a guy named Maurice Greenberg, who was actually nominated for the position of Director of Central Intelligence after he authored a report for the Council on Foreign Relations, of which he's a high-ranking member, where he advocated that FBI and Drug Enforcement Agency agents operating abroad should not be allowed to act independently of either the ambassador or the CIA, lest pursuit of evidence or individuals for prosecution cause major foreign policy problems or complicate ongoing intelligence and diplomatic activities. Of course, this type of policy is essentially a continuation of things like Executive Order 12333 and the CIA-assisted Contra cocaine trafficking that went on as an immediate result. These backdoor agreements open the floodgates for government drug money laundering and narco-trafficking. Former LAPD narcotics detective turned whistleblower Michael Rupert has written a series of excellent articles documenting AIG's involvement in drug money laundering, undoubtedly revealing yet another motive for the invasion of Afghanistan, a country which currently produces over 90% of the world's heroin supply. Drugs are arguably the most profitable commodity on the entire international market, and drug money was undoubtedly a motive behind the invasion of Afghanistan and consequently the 9/11 attacks. While companies like AIG launder the drug money for big banks, the actual drug production and trafficking can be traced back to the same Iran-Contra affiliates like Richard Armitage and Frank Carlucci. Unfortunately, that rabbit hole is a bit too deep and off-topic to get into here. I will mention that DynCorp was heavily involved, as well as Stewart Air Force Base in upstate New York, where the two flights out of Boston crossed paths simultaneously and shut off their transponders before making their way to the Twin Towers. Many researchers believe that the MENA operation was moved to Stewart Air Force Base after Barry Seal got whacked. Richard Armitage was the Deputy Secretary of State on 9/11, and according to whistleblower Michael Springman, he was the man responsible for granting visas to 15 out of 19 of the 9/11 hijackers, allowing them to enter the U.S. and pursue flight training. Frank Carlucci is the chairman of the Carlyle Group and was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, having just met with George H.W. Bush and the brother of Osama bin Laden on Carlyle Group business. Frank Carlucci was also the chairman of BDM International, a company that served as a front for State Department black operations. Frank Carlucci's employees at BDM International left to take charge of Stratesec, the World Trade Center and airport security firm. Corporate Operating Officer Barry W. McDaniel, an ex-military expert in logistics and materials distribution, and CEO Wirt Dexter Walker III, who is a distant Bush cousin from the Herbert Walker line, with an extensive history of managing CIA front companies. Marvin Bush, the president's brother, was also a board member at Stratesec, although Stratesec maintained contracts for security upgrades which were set to expire on September 11, 2001. They were not the company officially charged with World Trade Center security. This role was assigned to a risk management firm called Kroll Associates. Kroll's chairman, Jerome Hauer, was a longtime personal friend of ex-FBI counterterrorism expert John O'Neill and was responsible for O'Neill's appointment as head of security for the World Trade Center just a few days prior to the 9/11 attacks. O'Neill was the world's leading expert on Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and was a potential 9/11 whistleblower with hard evidence of White House complicity in the protection and shielding of the 9/11 hijackers from all means of federal investigation. Al-Qaeda hijacking suspects were flagged by the Able Danger terrorist tracking program, which was also shut down by the White House. Able Danger whistleblower Anthony Schaefer claims the U.S. government destroyed over 6 terabytes of data related to Able Danger, which he also claims identified 9/11 ringleader Mohammed Atta as early as February of 2000. Those atop the chain of command in the White House, military, and intelligence establishment deliberately ignored all the warning signs of an impending attack. A clever strategy of plausible deniability which also served to portray those in charge as incompetent rather than complicit. In every major head throughout the chain of command on 9/11, from NORAD to the military, we see a repeated theme of complicity through negligence or incompetence. After 9/11, failure and incompetence was rewarded and whistleblowers were silenced. Combined with the fact that 6 corporations control 90% of the media, and CIA operations like Mockingbird admit to taking over and subverting our U.S. media, we can understand how such a big lie could have been kept from the American public for so long. But if you stop and take the time to do your research, you'll find all the evidence is there, hidden beneath a mountain of disinfo and lies.
It's been 10 years since 9/11 happened, and we are left with hundreds, if not thousands, of unanswered questions about the 9/11 attacks. A transparently fraudulent 9/11 Commission report, which purposely failed to even mention the collapse of World Trade Center 7, and a host of ridiculous, so-called debunking websites, forums, and other literature, which have done absolutely nothing over the past 10 years to debunk anything other than cleverly selected strawman arguments, and have failed to stem the constant flow of new 9/11 information, which researchers have been uncovering and bringing out to the public. Instead, they continue to label truth seekers, including family members of people who died on 9/11, as conspiracy theorists, and devise clever propaganda designed to prevent the general public from looking any further into the evidence or the actual claims of the so-called conspiracy theorists. In this video, we will take a deeper look into the so-called investigations, which have provided us with the official story, and why they deserve a more thorough examination.
The Bush administration stalled government investigations into 9/11 for over 400 days.
A week after 9/11, letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to several news media offices and 2 senators who were perhaps a bit too vocal about opening an official investigation into 9/11.
The anthrax used in the attacks was identified as an Ames strain, which means it had to have come from the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick, Maryland. A member of that institute, Jerome Hauer, managed the National Institute of Health response to the anthrax attacks. Coincidentally, Hauer also warned the White House to start taking Cipro, an antibiotic which is effective against anthrax, a week before the attacks. Jerome Hauer also happened to be a managing director at Kroll Associates, which ran security at the World Trade Center up until the weekend before 9/11, when that role was personally handed off by Hauer to FBI agent John O'Neill, who would later die in the attacks, drawing strong suspicion that he was set up due to his knowledge of Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 hijackers, whom he was blocked from investigating while he was working at the FBI. In January 2002, President Bush personally asked Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle to limit the congressional investigation into the events of September 11th. The Bush administration only formed the 9/11 Commission after being prodded by the victims' families, who lobbied Congress for over a year to open the investigations. When the Bush administration finally did open a 9/11 investigation, it was described by some members as set up to fail.
The President has said only a minority of the Commission can see a minority of the documents, and then they have to clear what they're going to say to the rest of the Commission with the White House.
If you're one of those 4 that gets to see these documents, would that change your opinion?
No. They don't want any more eyeballs to see their documents than they can possibly get away with. It's a scam. It's absolutely disgusting.
They even attempted to appoint Henry Kissinger, a known cover-up mastermind, as head commissioner. He resigned after victims' family members asked him sensitive questions about his connections to the bin Laden family and the Carlyle Group. Philip Zelikow wrote the conclusions for the report before the investigation ever began, and even then any areas which did not support the official story were neither mentioned nor investigated by the 9/11 Commission. 6 out of 10 members of that commission have discussed on record how the government lied about the official story, and 70% of the questions posed by the victims' families were never answered or officially investigated. It's important to look at what happened to the evidence from 9/11. The day of 9/11, most of the FBI was in Monterey, California on an agency retreat.
Let's go to our State Department correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, what can you tell us?
Well, this from the FBI. The State Department has been evacuated. There was a meeting going on in the Operations Center. Other top officials were in the Situation Room at the White House. Colin Powell is in Bogota, Colombia, on a 2-day trip. But this very interesting information, Katie, Matt, and Tom, from the FBI, they had been operating a massive exercise from their hostage rescue unit. All of their top teams, about 50 personnel, helicopters, equipment, were in Monterey, California for the last 2 days, scheduled to fly back today commercially. So all of those people are out of place. It's fair to say, according to sources that we've talked to here at NBC, that the FBI rescue operations and other FBI operations are really in chaos right now because they can't reach their officials in New York. All of their phone lines are down, and now you've got all of their special experts on this stuck in Monterey, California, trying to get a military flight back because there are no longer commercial flights. So they are seriously out of pocket, and there is a real breakdown of the FBI anti-terror coordination team, which is, of course, the principal team that would lead any effort and was so effective under Jim Kallstrom in New York City during the World Trade Center bombing and the TWA explosion, which, of course, turned out not to be terror.
Andrea, is the State Department...
This was essential for keeping the more experienced and honest members of the agency as far away from the crime scene as possible, while other agency insiders could be assigned to the investigations before their counterparts returned. Federal authorities such as FEMA and the CIA took immediate control over the crime scene and began whisking away evidence that very same night. Turner Construction, one of the primary contractors at Ground Zero, occupied the 38th floor of the North Tower and was involved in performing the fireproofing upgrades inside the towers. It has been noted that these upgrades were completed in the 3 years before 9/11 on floors that match up almost identically to the floors of impact and failure on 9/11. Once the cleanup was fully coordinated, the operations were consolidated under the control of 2 primary contractors, AMEC Construction Management and Bovis Lend-Lease. These are the 2 companies that were originally assigned to the areas of Ground Zero that included the North Tower, AMEC, and the South Tower, Bovis. A truly surprising fact is that at the time of the attacks on 9/11, AMEC had just completed a $258 million refurbishment of Wedge 1 of the Pentagon, which is exactly where American Airlines Flight 77 impacted that building. Arguments over the size of the hole of the Pentagon and whether it was a plane or a missile are, in my opinion, a convenient distraction from the much bigger picture of why that section of the building was targeted and by whom. On September 10, 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced that $2.3 trillion in unadjusted funds were missing from the Pentagon budget. The very next day, the offices whose responsibility it was for tracking that money down were destroyed when American Airlines Flight 77 impacted that very section of the building. The only off-site backup for the Pentagon's black budget financial records was a secure federal office building in the World Trade Center complex. Strangely, it too was destroyed on 9/11. World Trade Center 7 was the largest CIA headquarters outside of Langley, Virginia, and housed offices involved in several large-scale federal investigations into massive stock market and accounting fraud. Not surprisingly, World Trade Center 7 was the first to be cleaned up and the evidence destroyed at Ground Zero. So if the Twin Towers in Building 7 were brought down in a controlled demolition, and the scientific evidence points to nanothermite, then who could have produced this, and who could have put it in the buildings, and how did they get it there? In the impact zone of the North Tower was a company called Marsh & McLennan, which at the time was the world's largest insurance brokerage company. One of Marsh's executives was a guy named L. Paul Bremer, who was also the chairman of the Congressional National Commission on Terrorism from 1999 to 2000, and the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism from 1986 to 1989. Instead of going to work on the day of 9/11 and dying inside the towers with hundreds of his employees, Bremer decided to go on MSNBC and tell the world that Osama bin Laden was behind the attacks and possibly Iraq and Iran, and then he demanded
the most severe military response we can come up with.
L. Paul Bremer was called away from Marsh in 2003 to become the Iraq occupation governor, a role he has been widely criticized for. So Bremer not only worked inside the buildings, but had offices directly in the impact zone of the South Tower where Flight 175 would hit. He missed work on 9/11 to give us the official story on national television, and went on to be the Iraq occupation governor. You really can't get more connected to 9/11 than that. Oh wait, you can, sorry. I forgot to mention that Bremer was also the former manager for Kissinger Associates. He was a member of the board for Akzo Nobel, the parent of International Paint Company, which produced a fireproofing application for skyscrapers called Interchar. Bremer was also on the International Advisory Board for the Japanese mining and machinery company Komatsu, which at the time had been involved in a joint venture agreement with Dresser Industries, the oil services intelligence front where Prescott Bush Sr. and George H.W. Bush got their start with Neil Mallon. Anyway, the Komatsu Dresser mining division operated from 1988 to 1997, and in July 1996 it patented a nanothermite demolition device that could, quote, demolish a concrete structure at high efficiency while preventing a secondary problem due to noise, flying chips and dust, and the like. As many of you know, residues of thermite, a highly energetic chemical mixture, have been confirmed in samples of World Trade Center dust, and the use of thermite at the World Trade Center was also revealed by environmental data. See the description for more links and sources. Scientific Applications International Corporation, a defense contractor with expertise in thermite-related technologies, played a large part in the NIST World Trade Center investigation. A few other names and companies inside the Twin Towers also worthy of further investigation include Craig Stapleton, who is married to Bush's cousin Dorothy Walker Bush. Stapleton was the president of Marsh Real Estate Advisors from 1982 to 2001. He was a member of the board of directors for Cendant, that was charged with massive accounting fraud in 1998, and went on to join Winston Partners, a privately owned investment firm founded in 1993 and led by George W. Bush's brother Marvin. Other very powerful and well-connected people worked in senior management at Marsh. These included Stephen Friedman, a senior principal at Marsh Capital and former partner at Goldman Sachs, who later became George W. Bush's top economic advisor. Friedman was also a member of the Brookings Institution, the Bilderberg Group, the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and the board at In-Q-Tel, the investment firm founded by the CIA in 1998. In-Q-Tel invests in state-of-the-art technologies related to defense and intelligence work, including nano and chemical technologies, according to its website. In another interesting coincidence, Friedman belonged through Cornell University to a secret society called Quill and Dagger, the membership of which includes Paul Wolfowitz, Sandy Berger, and Stephen Hadley. Wolfowitz, the neocon deputy secretary of defense in the Bush administration, was the author in 1992 of the Wolfowitz Doctrine of preemptive warfare. He also made comments about a surprise-like Pearl Harbor months before 9/11 and met with Pakistani ISI General Mahmoud Ahmed in the week before 9/11. Berger, the national security advisor to President Clinton, was later caught stealing documents from the 9/11 Commission investigation. Berger was also the boss of White House counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke, and together with Hadley, who was Condoleezza Rice's deputy, was responsible for delaying or obstructing Clarke's plans to stop al-Qaeda in January of 2001. Jeffrey Greenberg resigned from Marsh & McLennan after being accused of serious financial crimes. The first plane of 9/11 flew directly into his company's secure computer room in the North Tower. Jeffrey Greenberg is a member of the Brookings Institution and the Trilateral Commission. Jeffrey Greenberg rose quickly through management at Marsh, having come there directly from AIG in 1995, and then becoming CEO just 4 years later. At Brookings, Greenberg hobnobbed with Lee Hamilton, co-chair of the 9/11 Commission. There's also Jim Pierce, another Bush cousin, who was managing director of Aon Corporation, who, according to the NIST report, modified unknown sections of Floor 83 in the South Tower in 1997. Jim Pierce had arranged a meeting on the 105th floor of the South Tower for that morning. Pierce survived that day, despite the fact that 12 people came to the meeting in the South Tower and 11 of them died. The location of the meeting had been changed the night before to the Millennium Hotel, where Pierce watched the South Tower as it was hit by the aircraft. Apparently, the meeting attendees were not all notified of the change in location. Another interesting character is Joseph Kasputis, of Baseline Financial Service, which occupied the impact zone of the South Tower on floors 77 and 78, where United Airlines 175 impacted. Kasputis has a history of being well connected to the highest levels of government, as well as to the defense and intelligence industries. Kasputis worked from 1972 to 1977 for the U.S. Department of Commerce and Defense. He was also the deputy director of Nixon's White House task force that dealt with the Arab oil embargo of 1973, and was instrumental in the creation of the Department of Energy. Kasputis went on to run a large corporation called Primark that had offices in both towers on 9/11. One of the subsidiaries of Primark, the Analytical Sciences Corporation, TASC, worked with so-called black or top-secret programs. TASC also worked closely with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Kasputis was also a member of the Logistics Management Institute, LMI, whose members included Paul Kaminsky of In-Q-Tel and General Dynamics, Charles DiBona of Halliburton, Skull and Bones member Joseph Samuel Nye, and Michael Daniels of Scientific Applications International Corporation. LMI's self-proclaimed role is advancing the science of government. Kasputis' connections to the DOE from 1977 through at least 1997 are interesting, considering that the DOE was developing thermite ignition devices as early as 1983. Joseph Kasputis went on to become the CEO of Baseline Financial Services, which was directly in the impact zone on the 78th floor of the South Tower. According to NIST, Kasputis' Baseline Financial modified the southeast corner of Floor 78 in 1999, exactly where the aircraft hit on 9/11. Floors 77 and 78 were upgraded for fireproofing in June and April of 1998, respectively. Another company of interest on Floor 91, just above the impact zone for the South Tower, was Washington Group International. This company was known primarily as a construction and mining firm, and it had just acquired Raytheon Engineers in July of 2000. In 1996, Washington took over Morrison Knudsen, an engineering and construction firm that had a history of working on large-scale projects around the world, including in China, Iran, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia. The Army Corps of Engineers hired Morrison Knudsen to demolish over 200 buildings in 1995. One of the DOE facilities for which Washington was responsible well before 9/11 was the Savannah River site near Aiken, South Carolina. In February of 1997, Lawrence Livermore National Labs and the Savannah River site signed an agreement of cooperation to share technology. Savannah went on to add developing sol gel technology for fuels and other applications to its portfolio. Sol gel technology is utilized by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories for making nanothermites. In another coincidence, Savannah River Technology staff participated in the search and rescue operations at Ground Zero by providing unique tools. Just before 9/11, Washington was going through a tough time financially and sought Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Securities and Exchange Commission documents show that Washington made court-ordered pre-petition payments as part of these proceedings to a number of companies, including Komatsu. Washington also made payments to Greenhorn and Omara, whose employee Teresa McAllister was a lead author of the FEMA and NIST reports on the World Trade Center disaster, and to Sumitomo Bank, which was closely allied with Komatsu. Building 7 was a 47-story federal office building in the World Trade Center site, which collapsed at 5:20 p.m. on the afternoon of 9/11. This building was home to the CIA, in fact, the largest CIA headquarters outside of Langley, Virginia. It also housed offices for the Secret Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. One of the most interesting tenants, however, was then Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management and its Emergency Command Center on the 23rd floor. This floor received $15 million worth of renovations, including independent and secure air and water supplies, and bullet and bomb-resistant windows designed to withstand 200-mile-per-hour winds. Mayor Giuliani was a former U.S. prosecutor for the South District of New York from 1983 to 1989, who was in charge of investigating the terrorist financing Bank of Credit and Commerce International. After he left his job as a prosecutor to start a political career, he worked for a law firm called White & Case that actually represented BCCI. So he went from prosecuting the BCCI to working for a law firm which defended the BCCI. This was likely his foot in the door of this underground corporate criminal network. Giuliani would later help to destroy all the crime scene evidence from Ground Zero. Giuliani's sidekick on 9/11 was Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik, who appeared to be coaching some of Rudy's actions that day, keeping him away from the media and even answering questions for him about explosives in the buildings. In fact, Bernard Kerik gave us the first official government pronouncement that no explosives were involved in the destruction of the World Trade Center buildings. Kerik's department was also the same one that found that pristine, completely undamaged hijacker's passport, which survived a plane impact and fireball, which destroyed 2 titanium black boxes and 3 towers. Yeah, Kerik would later receive a nomination from President Bush to become Director of Homeland Security, which he declined for personal and political reasons, and instead took a job training the Iraqi police force in Iraq alongside L. Paul Bremer. Both men are credited for turning Iraq into the unwinnable quagmire it is today. In February of 2010, Kerik was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud charges, unrelated to the crimes of 9/11, unfortunately, but it still goes to show you what kind of person he is. Definitely the kind of person you'd want inside the New York City police force during a staged event like 9/11. And lastly, we have the Pentagon. It's certainly peculiar, to say the least, that al-Qaeda terrorists hell-bent on destroying the USA would not crash their plane into the north wing of the Pentagon, where all the most important offices were, like Donald Rumsfeld, John Ashcroft, etc., and that they would instead choose to target the one section of the Pentagon that had most recently been refurbished to withstand missile impacts. It's also interesting to note that the company which completed the $258 million refurbishment to Wedge 1 of the Pentagon was also hired as a contractor to clean up Ground Zero in New York City. Wedge 1 also coincidentally housed the Pentagon's Budget Analyst Office, where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that was reported missing by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld in a press conference the day before 9/11. The Pentagon's comptroller in charge of that money at the time was an interesting fellow named Dov Zakheim, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a contributor to the neocon think tank Project for the New American Century. Zakheim helped write the PNAC document Rebuilding America's Defenses, in which he is credited for the line which states, "Further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor." Several members of the Bush administration, including President Bush himself, would later refer to 9/11 as a new Pearl Harbor. A respected and established voice in the intelligence community, his views were eagerly accepted. And Dov went from his position at Systems Planning Corporation to become the comptroller of the Pentagon in May of 2001. Perhaps not so coincidentally, it was an SPC subsidiary, Tridata Corporation, that oversaw the investigation after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993. SPC, according to their official website, specializes in many areas of defense technology production and manufacture, including a system developed by their radar physics group called the Flight Termination System, or FTS. This is a system used to destroy target drones, craft that would be fired on by test aircraft or weaponry, in the event of malfunctions or misses. This highly sophisticated wargame technology allows the control of several drones from a remote location on varying frequencies and has a range of several hundred miles. This technology can be used on many different types of aircraft, including large passenger jets. According to the SPC website, A recent customer at that time was Eglin Air Force Base, located in Florida. Eglin is very near another Air Force base in Florida, MacDill Air Force Base, where Dov Zakheim contracted to send at least 32 Boeing 767 aircraft as part of the Boeing-Pentagon tanker lease agreement. As the events of September 11, 2001 occurred, little was mentioned about these strange coincidences and the proximity of Dov Zakheim and his group. Since there was little physical evidence remaining after the events, investigators were only left with photographic and anecdotal evidence. This is a photograph of the Flight Termination System module from their site. Note it has a cylindrical shape and is consistent with the size and shape of the object observed under the fuselage of Flight 175. The Boeing lease deal involved the replacement of the aging KC-135 tanker fleet with these smaller, more efficient Boeing 767s, which were to be leased by Dov Zakheim's group. The planes were to be refitted with refueling equipment, including lines and nozzle assemblies. In this enlargement of Flight 175, we can clearly see a cylindrical object under the fuselage and a structure that appears to be attached to the right underside of the rear fuselage section. When seen in comparison, it is obvious that the plane approaching the Trade Center has both these structures, the FTS module, and the mid-air refueling equipment, as configured on the modified Boeing 767 tankers. Of particular interest is the long tube-like anomalous structure under the rear fuselage area of 175. This structure runs along the right rear bottom of the plane. The equipment attached to the underside of the plane which hit the World Trade Center is identical in every single way to the Boeing 767s issued by Dov Zakheim.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Bring it back.
The video you're watching now came from Loose Change First Edition.
Did you catch that?
It appears to show the FTS pod self-destructing just before impact.
Also, notice that the flash is reflected in the fuselage of the plane. The flash is also present in footage taken by Evan Fairbanks, Jennifer Spell, and CNN. Al-Qaeda certainly couldn't have added this equipment at Logan International Airport. And even if they did, the flight crew would have noticed it. So where did this plane come from?
Another interesting piece of 9/11 evidence is the last 12 seconds of UA-175. Since every amateur videographer in New York City had their cameras pointed up at the burning Tower 1, the second plane strike was filmed from nearly every conceivable angle. Expert analysis of this plane leads to some startling revelations. First, there is the expertly controlled flight characteristics of this plane. During its last 12 seconds of flight, UA-175 made a single corrective maneuver so perfectly timed and executed that it's unlikely it was piloted by human hands.
One of the things that jumped out at me when I looked at the footage of the video of Flight 175 as it went into the World Trade Center is it appeared to me that there was something on the under fuselage of that aircraft that did not belong there, at least not with a commercial airliner. Now, I'll tell you where I have seen attachments that look like that on military aircraft. So the question you have to answer now is, was that the commercial airliner that hit the World Trade Center, or possibly was it an aircraft that looked very similar but was a military type airplane?
All the recorded sources, all the different photographic evidence that was produced by CNN and ABC, they all show this pod. It's there. You can see it with your own eyes. And in my professional opinion, that there was a pod attached to the bottom of that aircraft, and therefore it was not United Airlines Flight 175.
If you take a careful look at the flight paths of American Airlines 11 and UA-175, the two flights that took off from Boston's Logan Airport and crashed into the Twin Towers, you'll find a major clue. Not only did both these planes cross paths directly over Stewart Air Force Base, but they did so at the exact same time. Another odd synchronicity is Flight 93, which had been sitting on the tarmac delayed at the airport for nearly 40 minutes with no explanation. Originally scheduled to take off at 8:01 a.m., it was delayed until the moment that Flight AA-11 crashed into the North Tower at 8:43 a.m. Another interesting piece of evidence that ties Stewart Air Force Base to the center of this 9/11 conspiracy is the white mystery plane spotted over Washington and the Pentagon. Through careful investigation, we've been able to map out the flight paths of these two ominous aircraft, which have been identified as E-4Bs, a type of aircraft that the military uses as mobile command posts. What concerns me is that both of these aircraft took off from and landed at Stewart Air Force Base. Another interesting coincidence I found was that Flight 93 turned around directly over Hopkins Airport, and Flight 77 turned around directly over Tri-State Airport. Webster Tarpley has done some of the most thorough research into the wargame exercises that were taking place on the day of 9/11. But this white mystery plane, the Doomsday plane, what was it doing over the Pentagon and the White House on 9/11? Who was flying in that plane? What were they doing? Being the comptroller for the Pentagon and the chief financial officer, you have to kind of wonder what Dov Zakheim was doing on 9/11. And what his connections were to the $2.3 trillion that were missing from the Pentagon the day before 9/11. If anything, the individuals and organizations outlined in this video are at least as suspicious as the 19 hijackers themselves.
They have nothing on us. Why don't you? Book 'em, Dano.
Why did the United States attack Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen? Why are U.S. operatives helping to destabilize Syria? And why is the United States government so intent on taking down Iran, in spite of the fact that Iran has not attacked any country since 1798? And what's next? What are we headed for? When you look at the current trajectory that we're on, it doesn't make any sense at all if you evaluate it based on what we're taught in school. And it doesn't make any sense if you base your worldview on the propaganda that the mainstream media tries to pass off as news. But it makes perfect sense once you know the real motives of the powers that be. In order to understand those motives, we first have to take a look at history. In 1945, the Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar as the world reserve currency, which meant that international commodities were priced in dollars. The agreement, which gave the United States a distinct financial advantage, was made under the condition that those dollars would remain redeemable for gold at a consistent rate of $35 per ounce. The United States promised not to print very much money, but this was on the honor system, because the Federal Reserve refused to allow any audits or supervision of its printing presses. In the years leading up to 1970, expenditures in the Vietnam War made it clear to many countries that the U.S. was printing far more money than it had in gold. And in response, they began to ask for their gold back. This, of course, set off a rapid decline in the value of the dollar. The situation climaxed in 1971 when France attempted to withdraw its gold and Nixon refused. On August 15th, he made the following announcement.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This was obviously not a temporary suspension, as he claimed, but rather a permanent default. And for the rest of the world who had entrusted the United States with their gold, it was outright theft. In 1973, President Nixon asked King Faisal of Saudi Arabia to accept only U.S. dollars as payment for oil and to invest any excess profits in U.S. Treasury bonds, notes, and bills. In return, Nixon offered military protection for Saudi oil fields. The same offer was extended to each of the world's key oil-producing countries, and by 1975, every member of OPEC had agreed to only sell their oil in U.S. dollars. The act of moving the dollar off of gold and tying it to foreign oil instantly forced every oil-importing country in the world to start maintaining a constant supply of Federal Reserve paper. And in order to get that paper, they would have to send real physical goods to America. This was the birth of the petrodollar. Paper went out, everything America needed came in, and the United States got very, very rich as a result. It was the largest financial con in recorded history. The arms race of the Cold War was a game of poker. Military expenditures were the chips, and the US had an endless supply of chips. With the petrodollar under its belt, it was able to raise the stakes higher and higher, outspending every other country on the planet, until eventually US military expenditures surpassed that of all other nations in the world combined. The Soviet Union never had a chance. The collapse of the communist bloc in 1991 removed the last counterbalance to American military might. The United States was now an undisputed superpower with no rival. Many hoped that this would mark the beginning of a new era of peace and stability. Unfortunately, there were those in high places who had other ideas. Within that same year, the US invaded Iraq in the first Gulf War. And after crushing the Iraqi military and destroying their infrastructure, including water purification plants and hospitals, crippling sanctions were imposed which prevented that infrastructure from being rebuilt. These sanctions, which were initiated by Bush Sr. and sustained throughout the entire Clinton administration, lasted for over a decade and were estimated to have killed over 500,000 children. The Clinton administration was fully aware of these figures.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Miss Albright, what exactly was it that was worth killing 500,000 kids for? In November of 2000, Iraq began selling its oil exclusively in euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar and on U.S. financial dominance, and it wasn't going to be tolerated. In response, the U.S. government, with the assistance of the mainstream media, began to build up a massive propaganda campaign claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was planning to use them. In 2003, the U.S. invaded, and once they had control of the country, oil sales were immediately switched back to dollars. This is particularly notable due to the fact that switching back to the dollar meant a 15 to 20% loss in revenue due to the euro's higher value. It doesn't make any sense at all unless you take the petrodollar into account.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Let's take a look at the events of the past decade and see if you see a pattern. In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. US and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011, and after taking control of the region, US armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan Central Bank. Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the US government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, they established sanctions which US officials openly admit are aimed at causing a collapse of the Iranian economy. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements. The country is currently in the process of being destabilized with covert assistance from NATO, and though Russia and China have warned the United States not to get involved, the White House has made statements within the past month indicating that they are considering military intervention. It should be clear that military intervention in Syria and Iran isn't being considered. It's a foregone conclusion, just as it was in Iraq and Libya. The U.S. is actively working to create the context which gives them the diplomatic cover to do what they already have planned. The motive for these invasions and covert actions becomes clear when we look at them in their full context and connect the dots. Those who control the United States understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set off a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is absolutely nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. But rather than accepting the fact that the dollar is nearing the end of its lifespan, the powers that be have made a calculated gambit. They have decided to use the brute force of the US military to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. That in itself would be bad enough, but what you need to understand is that this is not going to end with Iran. China and Russia have stated publicly and on no uncertain terms that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. Iran is one of their key allies, one of the last independent oil producers in the region, and they understand that if Iran falls, then they will have no way to escape the dollar without going to war. And yet the United States is pushing forward in spite of the warnings. What we are witnessing here is a trajectory that leads straight to the unthinkable. It's a trajectory that was mapped out years ago in full awareness of the human consequences. But who was it that put us on this course? What kind of psychopath is willing to intentionally set off a global conflict that will lead to millions of deaths just to protect the value of a paper currency? It obviously isn't the president. The decision to invade Libya, Syria, and Iran was made long before Obama had risen to the national spotlight. And yet, he's carrying out his duty just like the puppets that preceded him. So who is it that pulls the strings? Often the best answer to questions like this are found by asking another question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Obviously, those who have the power to print the dollar out of thin air have the most to lose if the dollar were to fall. And since 1913, that power has been held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private entity owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful banks in the world. And the men who control those banks are the ones who pull the strings. To them, this is just a game. Your life and the lives of those you love are just pawns on their chessboard. And like a spoiled 4-year-old who tips the board onto the floor when they start to lose, the powers that be are willing to start World War III to keep control of the global financial system. Remember that when these wars extend and accelerate. Remember that when your son or your neighbor's son comes back home in a flag-draped coffin. Remember that when they point the finger at the new boogeyman, because the madmen who are running this show will take this as far as you allow them to. So how much time do we have left? It's a question I hear constantly, but it's the wrong question. Asking how much time we have left is a passive posture. It's the attitude of a prisoner who's waiting to be taken out to a ditch and shot in the back of the head. What are our chances? Can we change course? Also the wrong question. The odds don't matter anymore. If you understand what we're facing, then you have a moral responsibility to do everything in your power to alter the course that we're on, regardless of the odds. It's only when you stop basing your involvement on the chances of success that success actually becomes possible. To strip the ill-begotten power from the financial elites and to bring these criminal cartels to justice will require nothing less than a revolution. The government is not going to save us. The government is completely infiltrated and corrupt to the core. Looking to them for a solution at this point is utterly naive. There are 3 stages of revolution, and they are sequential. Stage 1 is already underway. Stage 1 is the ideological resistance. In this stage, we have to actively work to wake up as many people as possible about what is happening and the direction we're headed. All revolutions originate from a shift in the mindset of the population, and no other meaningful resistance is possible without it. Success in this stage of the game can be measured by the contagion of ideas. When an idea reaches critical mass, it begins to spread on its own and seeps into all levels of society. In order to achieve that contagion, we need more people in this fight. We need more people speaking out, making videos, writing articles, getting this information onto the national and international stage. And we especially need to reach the police and the military. Stage 2 is civil disobedience, also known as nonviolent resistance. In this stage, you put your money where your mouth is, or more accurately, you withhold your money and your obedience from the government, and you do everything in your power to bring the gears of the state to a halt. Practiced in mass, this method alone is often enough to bring a regime to its knees. However, if you fail at this stage, Stage 3 is inevitable. Stage 3 is direct physical resistance. Direct physical resistance is the last resort, and it should be avoided and delayed as long as possible, and it should only be invoked after all other options have been thoroughly exhausted. There are those who talk tough and claim that they will resist when the time comes, but what those people fail to realize is that if you are inactive during the first 2 stages and save your efforts for the last resistance, then you will fail. When the Nazis were moving door to door, dragging people out of their homes in Germany, that was the time to fight back physically. But due to the lack of ideological resistance and civil disobedience leading up to that moment, even an armed uprising would have likely failed at that point. An armed uprising can only succeed if the people have established an attitude of active resistance. And active resistance is only possible after their minds have broken free from the mainstream propaganda. If you want to fight back, it's now or never. You're not going to get another chance, and the stakes are far higher than they were in Nazi Germany.